Hey there, my name is Felix Contreras, and I am a journalist. I've worked at NPR for 21 years now, and I've been the co-host of the Alt Latino podcast for the last 13, and I have been booking the Latin music for the Tiny Desk concerts, which is where I'm sitting, for the last 10 years. And I'm so sorry I could not be there today. Because Hispanic Heritage Month, or Latina Heritage Month, or Latinx Heritage Month is our busiest time of the year for our Tiny Desk concerts, and we call them El Tiny. And this year has been crazier than normal, so my deepest apologies for not being there. Okay, identity. That's a deep subject. In fact, my reference to both Latino and Hispanic and Latinx speaks to the issue at hand. And so I'm going to solve once and for all just what it is we should call ourselves. Yeah, right. It's never going to happen. Obviously, things like a collective identity are important and can fluctuate as we've seen over the decades. But rather than chat about a collective identity, I want to share a story about my own experience dealing with what to call myself, or how more accurately, how I see myself. Because I recently learned that how we see ourselves can change throughout our entire lives. And let me explain that with a story. First and foremost, I am of Mexican-American background. I'm in my 60s and I was born here in the US. My mom and dad were born here in the US during the 1920s and 30s. My grandparents on my dad's side were from Guanajuato in Mexico, and my mom's people were in New Mexico and were part of that demographic in which the border moved on them in 1848. I am second generation and was raised before it came a point of cultural pride to speak Spanish and claim your culture. In fact, my mom didn't want my dad to teach us Spanish because she and him had been punished for speaking Spanish when they were kids, and she saw English as the only route to success in this world. And that is a very common experience among my generation, the boomers. As my sons constantly point out, I'm a boomer and not in a positive way. I grew up in Sacramento, California with both of my parents and three younger brothers. And between the time I started kindergarten in 1964 and went on to junior high school, I attended an elementary school that was probably 90% African American in an inner city neighborhood in North Sacramento called Del Paso Heights. I have my dad to thank for making sure we knew our Mexican heritage. I remember very distinctly coming home from school one day, and as usual, he asked me what I learned in school. And when I told him Hernan Cortez conquered Mexico, he said, "Have a seat, man, we got to talk." My dad was born in 1929. In fact, he just celebrated his 94th birthday last month. He's still in Sacramento, still very much mentally active. In fact, all I got to do is mention Trump and he gets all pissed off and starts talking about politics. So he's still very much with us. He grew up as a migrant farm worker, 9 siblings, mom and dad from Mexico, traveling across the US working the fields. My dad was born in Kansas, and I have uncles and aunts born in Colorado, California, a whole bunch of places. And they settled in Sacramento when they could no longer travel after my dad's dad died at an early age. He told me his dad was going to be a priest back in Mexico and eventually decided not to take his vows. So here was this farm worker who was the product of a Jesuit seminary education. He read all the classics in Spanish. He could speak Latin. He was great at math, was good at sciences. In short, a very learned man. My dad says that he taught him about Mexican history when he was a kid, working side by side with his dad in the fields when he was a kid. So when I came home with that propaganda about Cortez in Mexico, he set out to educate my brothers and I about the real history. So I was developing a sense of a Mexican identity, even as I grew up in the 1960s in a neighborhood that was almost all African American. And since music is now how I interpret the world around us these days, let me put it this way. When we would wake up every morning to go to school, I would change the radio station on that radio in the kitchen that we all have, would change it from my parents' Mexican music to the top 40 stations, playing Aretha Franklin, the Jackson 5, Sly and the Family Stone. And looking back, I can see I was developing a tri-cultural existence, eating Mexican food, hearing music in Spanish at family parties, because my mom loved mariachi, and I was doing the funky chicken at school dances. And I'm looking into the camera because I see some confusion out there. Funky chicken was a popular dance back in the 70s. If I was there, I would demonstrate it, but I'm not there, so you don't have to sit through that. I say tricultural because through TV and movies, we were exposed to mainstream culture or white culture. TV shows that featured all white people and white people problems and humor. movies that featured mostly white people. In fact, that was my main point of contact with mainstream culture, was through the media. At this point, and that is the point I want to make today, I didn't grow up in an environment in which my sense of identity and the value placed on that identity was dictated by people who placed a negative value on it. In other words, during those very crucial formative years between kindergarten and middle school, I didn't grow up with people putting me down because of my ethnicity. In fact, a lot of my friends seemed to gravitate toward our house around the time my mom was making flour tortillas in the evening, usually coming around saying, "Hey, Mrs. Contreras, can I get one of those tortillas and butter?" They were very popular in my neighborhood. But by doing that, they placed high value on what I took for granted every day. And that was crucial to my understanding of my place in this world. And here's the point I want to make today. I didn't see that. I didn't understand that. I didn't even realize that was my experience until just a few weeks ago. On our Art Latino podcast, we're working on a series of episodes to try to explain and understand the recent explosion of Mexican regional music, Peso Pluma, all those guys, right? As part of that process, our very talented series producer, Janice Shamoka, asked my co-host, Ana Maria Sayer, and I some questions about our experiences with our identities. And as I told the story I just heard about how I grew up, as I told the story you just heard about how I grew up, I heard it in a different way. I stood out as different to my little African-American pals, different, not lesser than. And it was suddenly clear to me why I have always spoken up and challenged people who try to put me down, probably even played a role in why I wanted to become a journalist, to tell our stories. And I never realized it until a few weeks ago. So the point of all this, yesterday was my birthday. I turned 65 years old. And I'm blown away that I learned something about myself, even at this age, that will help me understand who I am, how I see myself, and how the world sees me. So this thing about identity is a never-ending process. Identity, man. It's deep. Thank you. And thanks for having me, man.